I'm very excited to introduce our speaker. My husband's family, they were beekeepers, and I heard a lot about bees after I got married. This is M. Mueller. He's an approved spikenard beekeeping ambassador, having taken classes at Spikenard Farm Honeybee Sanctuary through 10 years of his beekeeping experience. Spikenard Farm's mission is simply to save the honeybee. We ambassadors, calling on our knowledge of beekeeping, biological science, and animal behavior, are using in-person gatherings, classes, volunteer days, festivals, and many other approaches to the world of the spirit. Seek to know her better. We seek to know the bee as a being manifesting in all aspects of the physical, natural, human perceptible world, and even in the cosmos. And we seek to explore ever deeper our love relationships with her. M. Mueller explores pollinators and their work while working himself on the soil and grounds of Against the Grain farm in Zionville, North Carolina, where he is a biodynamic assistant to the farmers. And I will hand it off to you now, Em. And I encourage you all to look up Spikenard's website and also the biodynamic, Against the Grain farm and biodynamics. All of those topics are worth exploring more. So take it away.
Thank you so much, Hope, for that wonderful introduction. And thanks, Paul, for leading the meditation. Yeah, so I can't tell you what a relief it is to be amongst a group of people who are fully aware of that the spirit world lies behind the physical world. And as we know, without the spirit, there'd be no physical, and without the physical, there'd be no spirit. So I'm especially happy because I'll be able to speak frankly with you. I won't have to self-censor myself, nor will I have to decide what level of spirituality, or more importantly, what vocabulary of spirituality people will use. I'll just be myself and speak what I know. Yeah. So let's see. Let me just see. If you are a beekeeper or already know a little bit about bees, would you mind just giving a little wave or something so I know who is actually working in the biological material world with the bee? Okay, great, good. I hope that you will. Gain from tonight something that you can take to your beekeeping. As Hope's. Well, as my introduction stated, my education in beekeeping, the important part of it came from the Spikenard Honeybee Sanctuary, where we take both a strongly physical and a strongly spiritual approach to beekeeping. For me, beekeeping, the interest in beekeeping has been about the animal itself, but also I saw that that animal was extending an invitation to me to explore the spiritual world through her presence and habits and physicality. And I hope that tonight you'll be able to see what I'm talking about. So what I'd like to do is I have a few photos and to just kind of get everybody up to speed about what is and isn't a bee and what their some of their more important habits are. We'll take a look. Please forgive the clunkiness of my technological interface. My computer is from 2009. So it has very few of the amenities that would make this easy, but I'll go ahead and start here. I'll start sharing my screen. Let's see. I need to, here we go. And
Yep, we can see it, and it's large.
Okay, if it's large, that's good. So this is what I'm talking about here is the honeybee. And notice a few features about the honeybee. Notice the fur. We usually don't think of insects as having fur, but this fur looks quite hairy. Notice the prominence of the eye and also the antenna, which is tucked just underneath that front leg. That antenna is a sensor of the world par excellence. It can sense an amazing array of things from scent and taste, sound, as well as feeling temperature, CO2 levels. So if a bee is buzzing around your face and you blow at it, you're showing exactly where the bee should orient herself if she wants to face you directly. So this is the honeybee, Apis mellifera, and it's the European honeybee. European honeybees live in large colonies of 10, 20, 40,000 individual bees. This one that's shown here is the worker bee. And the worker bee, bees are all female. There are males in the hive, male bees, that show up, that incarnate, I should say, at a specific time during the year. And then they excarnate and remain the hive, an entirely feminine being on the physical plane. Right away, that shows us a sense of mystery that the honeybee can provide. All right. So here's a honeybee on a flower doing a very characteristic thing. This honeybee seems to be gathering nectar from the flower. I can see that from the photograph because her baskets, which are in this part of her leg, her pollen baskets are empty. So I give you this vision of the bee here. Let's see, let's get this. Now, by way of comparison, this is a wasp on a flower. The honeybee calls us to also consider her many sisters that are all stinging insects, and the wasps are another one. So if someone says, "Hey, I was mowing my lawn and I ran over a bee's nest and got bit several times," what that person really means to say was he or she was mowing their lawn and they disturbed probably a ground-dwelling yellow jacket wasp nest, and the wasps stung that person. And I am kind of insisting in a way on that nomenclature because it's, if we can think more clearly, we can and speak more clearly about what we mean, I think our perceptions, both physical and spiritual, can be more precise. Let me just ask at this point, are you just seeing my menu with a bunch of little thumbnails?
Yeah, it was blown up, but now that one isn't blown up, which
Okay.
I was kind of okay with because it was a wasp.
Yeah. Yeah. So this is a paper wasp, and what she's doing is stripping some wood, some gray wood, that she will then make that gray hornet's nest that we're so familiar with. Wasp and hornet are practically similar terms, and we don't need to worry too much about the finer points of that. That's for the scientists to really worry about. Now, when beekeepers house bees, really we are giving them some space within which to prosper. And that space can take many shapes. This is an example of what's called a sun hive, and it's egg-shaped. Again, that's just one example, a little bit of an extravagant example. And normally, beekeepers have hives that look like this. These are called Langstroth hives because they were invented by a guy named Langstroth in the 19th century. These hives were designed by beekeepers for the convenience of the beekeeper and not the bee. They have become the standard cavity that we put the bee in. In a way, it describes our relationship to the bee, which is an extractive one. We love the bee because she furnishes us sweet honey and wax. And so our human tendency, especially when there's any economics that are around beekeeping, it is to mine the bee as if it were a non-living resource. And this kind of using of an animal in this way, for the bee especially, is extremely severe. I think we treat the bee, of all the domesticated animals, we treat the bee most poorly. We treat cows and sheep and goats and chickens often much better than we treat the honeybee. And some of that will become apparent later on. Within that box, there are frames that the bee makes her structure upon. You can see that there are several of these frames in a box. The bees have been building out comb, and now they're doing their work on that comb. And you can see how easy it is for the beekeeper just to grab one of these combs and pull it up and see what's going on and shove it back down. And at the end of the day, or when that beekeeper wishes some honey, they can take the frames out, put them in an extractor, whirl them around, and rob the honey from the bee. And this is something that we, for at least a couple of centuries, have considered normal behavior. It never was considered normal behavior before the modern world. And this is what a beautiful square frame filled with comb is. And I would just like to point out to you that along the top bar there's a light-colored capped structures. We're familiar with the honeycomb. In the lower right, you can see empty honeycomb here, or maybe there are eggs in there. That honeycomb is used both as a womb to raise young and also as storage for honey, which is here. And this one, I don't see any. This here might be a little bit of pollen, or bee bread is a better name. And then all of this is brood. And all of this is capped brood. Inside there are little larvae that the eggs are about to hatch into larvae. And when they do hatch out and they open up, then they're quickly fed by their sisters. and grow to maturity. Yeah. So this is an example of the comb up close, and notice that perfect hexagonal structure. It is always fascinated us how an insect can make such a perfect geometrical structure so effortlessly and naturally. And then that is what it looks like when it's in a frame. But when you, if you allow bees to inhabit a more organically shaped space, or if those bees are exceptional builders, and many bees are, you'll get really beautiful, beautiful forms of comb. Where the Langstroth keeps all of the comb very flat, normally bees will produce beautiful, waving, undulating combs, which act, as I said before, as a womb, as a nursery, as a storage area, as a dance floor for when the bees do their waggle dances in order to communicate with other bees around them. Good. At this time, let me see if I can stop my sharing for a moment and just ask if there are any questions so far. This is like a really quick a lesson on the physicality, or the physical nature of the bee. Yeah. All right, so things are starting to get interesting at this point. So I'm going to go back and share the screen. And let's see. Do you see the bees?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. So the bees are gathering pollen, and now you can see the pollen baskets that are beautifully full with the different colors of pollen. A bee will go to the same species of flower to collect the pollen. So this bee went to uncountable flowers to collect this color of pollen of a specific species. And this bee collected pollen from another species of flower, or and that's how they do. And then this one's coming in with no filled baskets, and so that would indicate that she is returning with nectar to the hive. And so this is where, for me, the mystery starts. Because let's imagine that the body of the bee is not the box that we provide her with, but that the body of the bee is the cluster that she stays in through the night. So, for example, this is an example in the open air of bees clustering. This is a swarm cluster, but it shows what a cluster is, where the bees are all contiguous with one another. And within the hive, this would be the size of the cluster of the bee within a hive is roughly the size of the human head. And so when you look, for example, at these frames, you see that that all of these frames are bisecting what wishes to be a perfect cylinder or close to that, a rounded form. So in the morning, once the sun starts shining, the bee, the workers leave the hive and go out into the world. And from that small cluster, they expand into what we may think of as a flattened disc approximately 6 miles broad. So 3-mile radius from the hive, and let's just use that figure for now. The bees are able to go out and forage. Yeah. And so they forage all day, and then they come back to the hive to deposit what they've brought, and workers within the hive then begin to process those goods that are brought in. And so for a moment, let's just imagine that the bee goes from being about a head-sized cluster of bees to, once the sun comes up, that cluster, which is the actual organism of the bee, starts to expand out into this 6-mile wide disc with the center around the hive. When we start really thinking about the bees, we notice that the bees aren't really animals. An animal is something that can move on its own, and surely this little bee can move on its own, and that can reproduce, but this bee cannot reproduce, and can feed itself, but this bee cannot feed herself. How do bees feed? How do they eat? They are bringing in nectar in their honey crop, their so-called honey crop, which is a storage area in their body. And when they come into the hive, they emit that gathered nectar to another bee that's waiting, and she takes it into her crop and then runs up the comb, puts it into a cell, and that cell is more and more filled as the bees bring in nectar. And then there's a process where, and you can imagine that once it's been inside the body, it has become imbued with different organisms that help start a ferment. And so this nectar ferments and is dried and becomes the honey that we know. The nectar as well gets worked up by the bees and the yeasts that are in the environment and in the animal's gut are able to act just as bread yeast does. And so rather than calling the food stuff that comes from pollen just mere pollen, we call it bee bread, because in fact it is a product that has been manufactured by the bee. And it's a good, long-lasting, stable food that is part of the food in the hive. So if the worker bee is unable to procreate, and certainly the male drone is unable to procreate, then the question is, how does this animal procreate? And this is when I would ask you to stop thinking of the individual bee as the animal and start thinking of the entirety of all of the bees as the animal. So at this point, things are getting really strange, because biologists call these things superorganisms. Superorganisms are organisms that are made up of various groups of other organisms that all combine to form one workable organism. They're fairly rare in the world. Best known examples might be the Portuguese man-o'-war, which is we often confuse as a jellyfish-like being, but it's really made up of different species that all join together to form a single organism. And also corals are of this nature as well. where individual species come together to make an organism that appears to be a single organism, and we call these superorganisms. So now that saying this, how does we're asking, how then does the hive reproduce? Let me go here. So here we see the comb. We see the workers doing their work. We see capped brood, which means that inside there are nymphs, there are larvae that are developing. We see what looks like, I'm not sure if this is a little bit of nectar in here. If it is, it's a little bit unusual, but I mean, not unusual. It's just often that the nectar will be going up at the top of the hive. Let's see, down here you can see a little grub. So the bee goes from an egg stage to a larval stage to a nymph stage, and here it is in the larval stage, like a little worm, and the cell hasn't been capped over yet. But look at these cells here. These are what's known as queen cells or queen cups, and you other beekeepers that are here can attest to what it looks like to see the thoughts of a bee, of the bee, and by now I'm speaking of the large organism. The thinking of the bee when it is thinking about procreating, when it is thinking about having a baby, you might say, because the workers will start building a little cup upside down about this big, and they'll draw it out a ways, and then if the queen is part of the thinking and the answer is yes, we do want to procreate, she will lay an egg into this queen cell. Notice how different it is from all of the other cells. The other cells are practically horizontal, and these queen cells are absolutely vertical. And this is the major factor that would cause a fertilized egg to become a queen, is the position. So this position, the horizontal position, is an earthly orientation. But this vertical orientation is one that is oriented towards the cosmos, specifically toward the sun, but towards all the cosmos. And this is what makes the queen, is the orientation. To me, that's just a mystery that speaks of mysteries. So I haven't spoken at all about how the queen gets pregnant to start things off. That's coming in a little bit. But what happens when a hive procreates is this. What you see, bring this down. What you see is this. This is a swarm that is starting. The mystery of how a bee swarm begins is profound, and we haven't seen our entire way into it. But at a certain moment, the old queen in the hive, accompanied by perhaps, let's just say, half of the hive, flies out in this beautiful, loud cloud of bee-ness. And it goes through the air, and what it's looking for is a place just to land. So here it is. That swarm then comes together on the bough of a tree, in this case. So once again, that gesture of expansion and contraction is being shown here. And so now this is the offspring of the hive, and yet the offspring is the old queen and the older workers. It's not the new, fresh, newly hatched queens coming out of those queen cups with the newest batch of young workers coming out. Birth is a matter of the elders removing themselves and forming a cohesive entity that will begin life anew, leaving the young queens who may or may not have hatched yet back in the original box. They in turn will hatch, and one queen will prevail, and she will go out on a marriage flight. And again, that flight, the orientation of that flight is practically straight up. She's accompanied by her court of, say, 6, 8, or a dozen workers that direct her to a drone congregation area. So the male bees that we saw in the on the comb here. Let's see. Here is a drone here. You can see these enormous eyes. This is a male. And during the afternoon hours, they all leave the hive and they visit neighboring hives as far as they can go. And ones that are in the mating mood will go to a drone congregation area, which is like a swarm, but of all male bees. And these drone congregation areas, year after year, will form in the same place. The queen bee, accompanied by her court, will make their way to the drone congregation area, and that queen bee will take off straight towards the sun, as if her heart is directing her only towards the light of the sun. The drones give chase, and a number of them will mate with that queen. It is an act of sacrifice. The drones on both sides, the queen and the drone, because the drones upon mating die. Their entrails come out and they fall back to earth. So it's a little messy. But then the queen returns fertilized to the hive. Those, let's say, 6, 8 dozen drone mating with her, all of that semen remains with the queen, and that's her only wedding flight. That's the only time when she receives the male seed. She keeps that in her body for her entire life. And when it comes time to lay eggs in the comb, she will release an egg and a sperm together. At the same time, they will form an egg rather quickly in the course of a short amount of time. We're talking a few hours at the most. And the egg will be female, 100% female. When the need of the hive is to produce males, she constricts a muscle and keeps the sperm in the organ called the spermatheca, which just is a Greek word for the seed plate. The storehouse of the seed, and she will lay eggs that are clones of herself. And the clone of the female queen is actually the male drone. So this is another mystery, how an exact replica, a DNA replica of a female can yield a male. But this is normal for the bee. This is the normal way to do it. So, yeah, at this point, we've really kind of gone deep. Let me stop sharing for a moment and let's all just catch our breath and see if there's any questions about anything that I've discussed, which is the daily expansion and contraction. That is the animal of the bee, and then that gesture of parturition, where the old leaves the young in place, goes out to form the new organism. Now, what happens with those bees there, I'll just quickly give you the end of the story, is they'll hang in that tree for as many as 3 days. Scout bees will go every which way, looking for a recess that is an ideal size and ideal conditions. They'll come back and report what they found. They'll do the waggle dance. They'll generate a little enthusiasm. More bees will fly out with them to see if they're really, just how good this recess is. Meanwhile, other scout bees have found other resources. They're doing their waggle dances. There may be 8, 10, 12, 20 scout bees all doing waggle dances for different recesses. By recess, I mean hollows of different kinds. And then at a certain point, the votes are all cast, and immediately that swarm takes off into another whirlwind and enters the recess, where they begin drawing wax, and as soon as the first cells are drawn, the queen starts laying eggs, and that is the baby. That is the offspring of the mother hive. So we can see that things are all really different. The biology is completely different than the biology in mammals. But the question is, and here's the question, is the bee an insect or is she a mammal? So we are used to insects providing many more eggs and creating all kinds of young, but the bee only produces 1 and sometimes 2 or 3 at most offspring in a year, which is a mammalian thing to do. We mammals will usually have 1 offspring per year, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, or when you get to the smaller ones, of course, many more, but not 40,000. So, yeah, so the bee is really, in her habits, is really asking us to dig deeper into the mystery of, into the mystery of the spirit of the bee. Good. Any questions?
Em, could I ask a question about, I guess, it would be the consciousness of the hive or the bee. Now, I'm beginning to see, at least from what you've told us, that there's a collective consciousness here. And yet we think of the hive as each of the different bees have roles to play. We talk about the hive mentality, the role of different bees, and yet it seems that there's a lot of shared decision making and thinking involved with the collective. Can you kind of dig in that a little bit?
Yeah, certainly. That's a great question, Ron, and thank you for it. I'd like to go in two directions with that. So first, to answer more directly the direction that your question, I think, is going in. We saw how the Queen Cups is a way where we humans can see the thought process of the bee a little bit. The bee is thinking, is it good? Is it good to split at this time and form a new colony or new being? And we have seen that the scout bees do their dance on different parts of the swarm and generate enthusiasm, we might say. But to answer your question, at a certain moment, one of those recesses becomes the evident place where the entire hive, where the entire swarm will go. And when scientists, and the scientist that really has done the best work on this is a man named Professor Tom Seeley from Cornell University in New York. His last book, it was called Honeybee Democracy, and it's addressing the questions, Vaughn, that you're bringing up. How does the hive make the decision to do something? And so by calling that book Honeybee Democracy, Dr. Seeley is taking the viewpoint that it is like a voting process. Now, let me answer that question another way. It may not be a voting process, but there may be a unified spirit to the entire hive that we can see little particles of that decision-making process happening. But let me give you a different example. Bees have facial recognition. The organism of the bee, when I visit my bees, they know me. One comes out and does this, does a little scan, goes back, and no alarm is sound. A bear, on the other hand, approaching the hive, the bee will come, will do the scan, and will sound an alarm. The entire hive knows. Now, here is something that's interesting, Vaughn, is that the average individual worker bee in the height of the summer may live for 6 weeks if she's lucky. Bees are so giving that they literally work themselves to death as their life's work. There's no rest because they do not desire rest. They desire only to serve. In the winter, the bees that overwinter have a longer life than that. It can go on for months, and there's no activity. There's no coming and going and wearing out their wings and getting exhausted and falling into puddles and drowning and all of that stuff. So they last a little longer, but still they all die out early in the spring as the new brood is coming on. But the facial recognition still works even after every individual bee has perished that has recognized my face. The hive still knows. How this information is passed on, I think, is a mystery that your question is addressing. So there is some consciousness that goes on. And I'll just offer one other thing. Sometimes, believe me, it happens, and I have witnessed it. When a beekeeper dies or moves away, there is there often is a violent reaction amongst the bees the longer the beekeeper is away. Colonies will end up dying or lose their orientation. And so that's a spirit-to-spirit relationship. That's not an individual insect to human relationship. We're talking about my soul capacities as a beekeeper are informing how I assist the bee through her life as comfortably as can be expected in a box that has been designed for her confinement.
Yeah.
And the relationship between the individual hive and me is one of two entities, much more like when I go out to the cows. And the mama cow sees me coming and knows that I often will have an apple in my pocket. Or when I take her baby and I put the little training halter on her. We're acting as spirit to spirit, being to being. She knows I'm not going to hurt her calf because we've developed trust. She won't let me touch her because she's wild and doesn't want to have anything to do with me, but she'll let me have everything to do with her calf because we've established a relationship. So I hope that if it doesn't answer your question, that it maybe shines a brighter light on the question itself.
Thank you. What a great answer. I was just remembering at the Theosophical headquarters in Illinois, we had, when I was there years ago, some hives, and we had Italian bees. And I was told they were very gentle, let them land on you. It was my first real opportunity to relate to bees on a very friendly spirit-to-spirit level. But what I noticed in the winter months when it got very cold, as Illinois will do, is, of course, the bees didn't come out of their hive, but they would station, I think, 2 bees at the entrance, and they would stay there until they were frozen dead. I was just wondering which bee would do that? The drone, the worker, who would it be?
Great question. So the life of the drones is basically from in our latitudes from May through, say, August, September, October is when the drone incarnates, and then it excarnates. So what you were experiencing there were worker bees. Worker bees go through a cycle or a series of different functions in the hive, different jobs, different tasks. So when a bee first pulls herself up out of her birthing cell, rubs her eyes, looks around, the first thing she does is starts assisting in cleaning the cells next to her. Then after that, she graduates to perhaps being a mortuary bee, where if there's a bee that is diseased or has died or something, she'll go pull it out and drop it down onto the floor. And this goes around, and that's a very hygienic process. As time goes on, she goes through other iterations until she becomes she goes down to the mouth of the hive and can become a guard bee. So it's most likely that you saw guard bees on duty. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Had a lot of respect for those guard bees.
Yes. And also, if you ever see a honeybee gathering water, you should really give honor to that bee, because it is the eldest of the bees that go out and get water. The bee is entirely a being of fire, of the sun and of the air, not at all of the earth and the water. And so it's the oldest bees, the savviest of them, and also the most expendable, that go and gather water. And when you see how clumsy bees are in the water, you may see them swimming in a swimming pool. You can just pick them up on your finger and set them on dry land, and they'll get dry in about 3 minutes and fly away again. Yeah, I really always honor those bees that are getting, because they have been through the whole the whole unrolling of their lives. Yes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
So I had a question, and then I have a thought that it's about 8:04. So after my question, maybe we'll take a break. This is so fascinating. What I was, I know there's this artificial thing of moving hives to California and all of the commercial bees that kind of have eternal summer. It must be kind of exhausting for them. But, I have a farm and there's bees that are moved between way northern Minnesota, and then at the right time they go to California and then they come back. But natural bees, bees that are allowed to just be natural out there, they must be also interacting with the temperatures, not just, and also like the solstice, the angles of the sun. That must all be just part of their biology to be aware of the seasons. And what does it do to them to be in one, like our season's very different here, but then they're brought someplace else. Like, how do bees even survive this? That's like, I'm hearing how vulnerable they are. How are they surviving all this disruption? That's my question.
Good. And I'll let Georgie answer that. I think she'll talk about that a little bit. But the short answer is something else that we can really look to the bee for is that the bee is a creature of service. And so humans take advantage of that desire to serve, and that same inner impulse to work until she dies is the same one that keeps her alive through these transformations. Your question about the different environments, I'll just add one little tidbit to show how this insect is truly something remarkable. During the summer, the bee is able to keep and must keep the hive right at about 94 or 95 degrees. It's body temperature. It's human body temperature that the hive is kept at. In the winter, that temperature can drop kind of like a mammal hibernating can allow their body temperature to drop. And so that body temperature will remain in around 50 degrees, which is actually the same ambient temperature of the earth. So under all this snow, even in Minnesota, go down a few feet and the temperature of the ground is around 50 degrees. And the fact that an insect is able to keep that temperature going is another, is something that's worth paying attention to. All right, so just so that everybody can get a little drink of water, I'll just leave it at that. And then when we come back, I'll introduce Georgie, and she can give us an expanded understanding of the bee and human relationship and the divinity of the bee. Welcome back. Let's see. I put in the chat the name of a new book that's just come out for the beekeepers and for anyone who would like an introduction to beekeeping that's in service to the bee. And this is a book called A Lively Hive by Alex Tuckman. Is that backwards to you all?
No, it looks fine.
Okay.
We can read it just like it is.
Okay, good. And so it's also in the chat.
Great.
Georgie, I would like to introduce my wife, Georgie Donavon, who is, I don't know how to describe her in the relation to the bee. Cheerleader is not good enough.
I can do this.
Huh?
I was like, I could do this. You don't have to.
Okay, now let me just ask you. I did want to read the passage from the bee lecture about the substance of the hive. Should I do that?
I was going to read that too.
Okay, then you go ahead and read it, and I'll say no more. She is somebody that needs no introduction. My wife, Georgie Donavon.
Oh my goodness. I work at Spike and Ard Farm Honeybee Sanctuary as a grant writer, but Hope, just nod. Can you hear me okay? This is a little bit odd using headphones. And I've been passionate about the bees for quite some time, and you'll hear Em and I deliberately talk about the bees because we mean to include the native bees as well. And I'm not promiscuous with my affection to love all pollinators equally, but the Hymenoptera have a special place in my heart, and the honeybees in particular, because of this colony, this living in community that I think Em described really well. And I've got a little bibliography of books like the Thomas Seeley book that Em mentioned and A Lively Hive that I wanted to paste into the chat. It's not pasting perfectly, but I'll just email Hope or try and do it the chat when Em takes over from me. But the thing that I wanted to bring to the conversation of the bees that I knew that this audience would appreciate more than most of the people that I talk to. The other thing that I do is grow pollinator plants for a nonprofit. And I'm always trying to talk about how grass doesn't feed anybody. And rhododendrons and azaleas and laurels, the things that we have that are native plants around here don't feed anybody either. They're beautiful. But you really have to make deliberate action in this world to give succor to native bees and to honeybees, or they will go extinct. And unlike the monarchs, which are particular and need a single plant, you know, they need milkweed everywhere in this corridor from Mexico, from the trees that they visit to Canada where they winter. Honeybees are very loving and promiscuous to all flowers. And indeed, I would ask you to start playing with your idea of botany, and which has taught us that the female and the male parts of the flower are in the flower, in the plant. And the bee is just mixing them up and relating them to one another. I think one question I might pose to you as Paul, I think earlier said the word koan, like a Zen koan is the bee pollinating the flowers, or is the bee the genitalia for Mother Earth to be impregnated with plants? And the result of our not taking the bees seriously, as we so frequently in our culture negate the feminine divine. You know, yoga in the West has become competitive hot yoga. We could take anything and make it hard and masculine, you know, and anything and make it, turn it into, you know, a competitive way to, you know, treat all these insects. And I think that, yeah, so often we take things that deserve respect and honor and liberation and turn them into money. Yeah, turn them into profit, right? So this is exactly what's happened to the bees. And what I really wanted to do is like read a couple of passages that have moved me in my service to the bee and given me a spiritual underpinning for my honor and reverence and a sort of a spiritual relationship with the bee and with my own feelings of how the divine feminine should be treated and honored in this world. So I'm going to start with a little passage from my teacher's book, A Lively Hive by Alex Tuckman. Alex is the director right now of Spikenard Farm Honeybee Sanctuary in Floyd. And it's just a great, I mean, this is a great like 101, I'm a beekeeper, what do I do all year book. But he starts out describing the Spikenard method of beekeeping. And he takes a quote from somebody that I think a lot of us in the Theosophical, Anthroposophical realm respect, who's Rudolf Steiner. Em and I practice biodynamic agriculture, and we live on a biodynamic farm. And biodynamics is a predecessor to organic agriculture that was described and kind of circumscribed in 8 lectures by Mr. Steiner almost exactly 100 years ago. And among the things that he lectured on, in addition to, you know, Waldorf schools and architecture and health and nutrition and anthroposophical medicine and homeopathy, one of the things that he lectured on is bees. And he describes the substance of the hive that is created by this single hive body, as Em describes it, that includes one queen, a lot of workers and drones and larvae and eggs, this comb, this honey, this bee bread that has been created. But this whole community and ecosystem, which I do think is related to place very much in the same way that plants are very related to place. I think that the phenomenon of wrapping a hive at night in saran wrap and putting it on a tractor trailer truck and driving around to gorge on a monoculture of almonds or apples or blueberries is akin to torture, and just eating one food for 4 weeks and then going somewhere else. And the only thing that really helps me feel better about the whole thing is the fact that it's very new. It is very new and very weird to do agriculture like this. It is a very recent phenomenon that people were able to sell bees as pollinators for their work, as opposed to just take the surplus of honey that the bees do. And one of the actions that I would ask you to consider in your heart is how to liberate the bee. For everything that I know about love is that love requires freedom, a liberation. And so we must liberate this beautiful creature from the demands we've placed on her, even to visit our flowers. And only then will she be able to create the substance of the hive, which is love, which is her survival mechanism. You can't have that substance when you're enslaved to crops, monocrops, or honey operations, or any other great idea that people have to put on the bee. So I'm very much a goddess warrior, a Durga, about the bee. And I don't mean to be like crazy bee lady, but I am. It's too late. It just got messed up a long time ago. And now I can't help it that when we talk about spraying things, I just, I'm fierce. One thing that Alex says in his book, he says the Spikenard method is a path of knowledge at its foundation. In order to answer the question of when to act versus when to hold back, we ask what the bee needs and then ask what we can do to serve those needs. We strive for knowledge of her basic life processes, instincts, and wisdom, and approach the mysteries and enigmas of her being with awe, reverence, and devoted attention. We ask what the bees need and then learn to listen. In this way, we begin to develop within ourselves the most practical tool in beekeeping, love. If we approach the bees with love and allow it to continually grow between us, new life will be infused into our beekeeping practice day by day. The bees will be comfortable with our presence and will be encouraged by previous positive experiences when we come to care for them again with this understanding. The path of knowledge that we work from has its compass needle pointed toward the development of human love. The wisdom of the honeybees is the compass needle itself. The quote from Rudolf Steiner is, "That which we experience only at a time when our hearts develop love is the same thing that is present as the substance in the beehive. The whole beehive is permeated with life based on love." The whole beehive is permeated with life based on love. I'm going to read just a short paragraph from a book called The Shamanic Way of the Bee that I'll also give you a link to. I've got all the, when I say nobody feeds on grasses, yeah, I can't help it. He says people, and it's saying in the notes. And I'm like, you're not helping anybody with that. And I mean none of the bees. In The Shamanic Way of the Bee, it's written by a man who was introduced to beekeeping in, I think in Wales. It's been a while since I read this book, but there are some parts of it that are really descriptive of the sacred nature of the bee. And I just want to read a little paragraph or two. The word Melissa, which is the genus word that we use for the European honeybee, Apis mellifera, that is here on this, that has been brought around in these big colonies all throughout the history of agriculture. So for 10,000 years, we know of people climbing up to harvest some honey, climbing up into trees, climbing up into rocks. There's petroglyphs and pictographs throughout the Holocene up to today of this relationship between bees, agriculture, which is not nature, it's nature plus man. So this agriculture and bees and humanity, they're inextricably linked. So it's ridiculous to talk in a natural way about whether they're native to this continent or not. There are many, many bees that are native to this continent, and honeybees were brought here because they populate something like 70 or 80% of the food crops that have been developed over time for us to eat. So if you like eating, you will enjoy honeybees in your environment. Okay, so Simon is talking about this history of the bee, and he says the word Melissa simply translates as bee. The first Melissa was said to have cared for the infant Zeus while he was being hidden from his father, the king of all the gods. Melissa plundered beehives in order to feed honey to Zeus. When Melissa's role in protecting Zeus was discovered, she turned into what was considered a lowly species of insect, and Zeus later took pity on her and turned her into a honeybee, forever involved with making honey. Melissa was also the goddess of intoxication and sexual passion, both of which may be used as doorways to a communication with all of life. And this is the archaic impulse that they continue to transmit. Consider that the bee is the copula between the male and the female elements in the flower. We also know that the bee can be a beacon for souls, guiding the dead on their way to the next worlds. So one thing, we quickly can observe about the bee is she's transformative. She takes substance of nectar and pollen and turns them into product. She cooks and prepares and heats and cools and evaporates them. So she's transformative in nature, being able to create comb from her own body, being able to create honey and bee bread, and being able to generate life without being inseminated. So she can generate drones without being inseminated. It's after she is impregnated by, usually on one single flight out of the hive, impregnated by as many drones as can meet her, that she has enough fertilized eggs to make worker bees for the rest of her life. And she always has the ability to lay a drone egg too. So it's at her will of, or rather at the hive's compromised will of what kind of eggs she lays, because there's also the decision of what kind of cells they're making of honey, whether they're making queen cups or worker cells. So she's self-generating. She can generate life, and she's transformative. She's self-generative, and I'm going to name one last aspect. There's so many aspects of the goddess incarnate that one might recognize. You might reach back into your own vocabulary of goddesses and feminine energy to whether it's the Greek goddesses of Aphrodite and Athena and Hera and Demeter, or if you're more familiar with Freya or Bridget from Celtic or Norse mythology. I'm the most comfortable with the Hindu deities myself, having spent a lot of time studying the South Indian traditions in the Tamil region of Shakti, of feminine divine energy. And so I'm going to talk about Shakti in terms of this representation on earth that the bees give of Shakti, of divine, creative, feminine energy. And this bridge between this world and the unseen world, which you might call this the spiritual world, but I'll just say whatever unseen energies that you are aware of. So too are the bees. And that's the world that they can bring messages back and forth through. As you're meditating meditate for a moment on your own connection to what the divine feminine in mythological terms or in personal terms means to you. You might think about the ways that you were that you have encountered that feminine energy, or it may be a very academic memory of goddesses and what they were like. And while you have this personal connection to goddess energy, what I'd like to do is read just one story from this book by Sally Kempton that's lovely, called Awakening Shakti. And she does a great job of describing 11 of the beautiful deities in Hinduism. So Durga and Kali and Parvati are all there. And she begins by telling the story of Sati and Shiva way back in the day, back in the dawn of time. And I'd like to tell you that story, and I think it will close out my part of thinking. I think it will be so easy to see quickly, like, how the bee is just so perfectly this manifest vision of what we think of as goddess energy. Back at the dawn of time, the great goddess who created the world and then lives as the world was asked to incarnate as Sati, she who is, or the ultimate female, in order to make the sacred marriage with her eternal consort, Shiva. Without her presence, Shiva cannot act in the world. So Shiva being the consciousness, the I am, and Shakti being the cosmic energy that animates that consciousness. Without her presence, Shiva cannot act in the world. He sits on a mountain lost in meditation, disdaining to perform his cosmic function. This creates havoc in the cosmos. So the great deities, Brahma the creator and Vishnu the sustainer, approach the goddess on their knees. They beg her, for the sake of the world, to take the form of a woman and lure Shiva out of his yogic trance. Daksha, a mind-born son of Brahma, will be her father. The goddess agrees, but only on one condition. She has seen that men and gods have begun to treat women as property, lesser creatures in the cosmic hierarchy. If I agree to become your daughter, she tells Daksha, you must promise to honor me as a great goddess. If you do not, I shall instantly leave my body, for I will know that the time is not yet right for me to act fully in the world. Daksha humbly agrees, and Sati is born in his household, and at 16 she marries Shiva, drawing him out of his meditation through the allure of her irresistible beauty and the power of her to create bliss. Shiva is the primal outsider of the Hindu pantheon, the lord of thieves as well as yogis. The original shaman as well as the primal yogi, he resides in the deep forests and mountains, attended by ghosts and goblins. He refuses to change his homeless lifestyle just because he has a wife. So for eons, Shiva and Sati make passionate erotic love under trees and beside streams, in subtle realms beyond the clouds and in secret mountain caves. They adore each other with cosmic passion. Then the trouble starts. A few thousand millennia have passed. Daksha has worked his way into a position of power as the leading deity of religious orthodoxy. In the process, he has forgotten his promise to the goddess and forgotten his daughter's true nature. He disapproves of Shiva's rebel status and feels personally threatened by Shiva's obvious disdain for convention. Daksha plans a huge cosmic fire ritual which will establish for all time the religious structures of the universe and invites every god, titan, celestial magician, the musicians, the poets, the snake deities, the nymphs, the fires, salamanders, everyone in the universe. But in a fit of celestial malice, he deliberately sends no invitation to Sati, his daughter, or her consort. Sati hears on the day of the sacrifice the news of the fire ritual, and she is stunned beyond measure. Daksha has done the unthinkable. Not only has he grievously insulted her beloved, he has dishonored the world mother, the power of life itself, without whom religion is meaningless. Sati knows she cannot remain in a world that does not recognize her. She sits in meditation, summons her inner yogic fire, and sends her life force into the ether, leaving her body behind. Shiva goes mad when he finds her. He takes himself to the ritual ground and destroys the sacrifice. He takes Sati's body in his arms and begins to careen through the worlds. Wherever he carries her body, earthquakes and volcanoes, tidal waves and forest fires erupt. At last, the gods do the only thing they can do to save the universe. They send the great wanderer Saturn to cut Sati's body into pieces. As the parts of her body fall to earth, they become physical pockets of sacred ecstasy, earth shrines. For eons in hidden caves and beside trees, near bodies of water and at the heart of villages, people will find the goddess enshrined in the soil and the rock herself. Her body is the sacrifice that infuses the divine feminine into the earth. The goddess is transformative. She's self-generative. She decides herself whether her force will be on this earth or in the cosmos. She has great energy to move actions. And she commands great respect and honor, great protection at the same time for her vulnerability. But great respect for that power and independence, for if we don't give the goddess her independence, true love, a true union between the masculine and feminine is not possible if she is not liberated. I don't mean to speak about gender. I'm very comfortable with the idea of archetypal metaphors as being useful to us while no longer equivalent, or maybe if they ever were, to human experience. Mr. Steiner says every human is as different from every other human as one species of animal is to another. And none of this is to imply that that male and female, anything about male and female or gender as we express ourselves in this physical plane. But I do mean to talk about something that does deserve to be honored, which is this feminine energy, whether it's Mother Earth or beyond. That without that liberation from our demands upon her, then the bee will never thrive and will never be in the place of honor in our lives and in our world that she should be, which is a true union. A connection, a great connection with plants, a great connection with humanity as we've come up together a great connection with place. And the last thing I'll read is just a little 3-line part of the Rig Veda, which is the oldest of the hymns that the Indic world sees as coming inspired directly from the gods. So the songs, the hymns that came directly, not even through people. Somebody just wrote them down as heard from the God's voice. And this is in the Devi, the female deity, the female deity at large, but the sutra is for the Devi, for the goddess. And this is the praise hymn of the goddess from the Rig Veda. Begins, I'm the sovereign queen, the treasury of all treasures, whose breathing forth gives birth to all the worlds, and yet extends beyond them. So vast am I in greatness. I think that's all I really wanted to share. I'm very passionate about the bees, as you can tell, and honoring them and protecting them and giving them great liberation to be bees.
Thank you, Georgie. So by bringing up love, I think you've brought up where my personal direction in terms of observation of the bee is going. I feel that we've been reading a lot and maybe too much, but I would like to just share the broader context that Georgie made a quote from, because I think it's so important to understand more about this substance of love that within the hive is the substance of love. I think within that mystery, how can a substance be love? The contemplation of that is really fruitful, and it may be one of the great gifts that the bee gives us. Rudolf Steiner, in a lecture to the workmen of the Goetheanum, the home of anthroposophy, says, everything in the environment that surrounds the earth in all directions has an extremely strong influence on what goes on in the beehive. Life in the beehive, much more so than with ants and wasps, is based on successfully cooperating and working with the other bees in the hive. If you try to figure out how this comes about, you will, after careful observation, draw the following conclusion. The bees have a life in which that element is suppressed, very strongly suppressed, which in other animals is expressed through their sexual life. With bees, this element is very much repressed. You see, with bees, it is always the case that only very few chosen females, the queen bees, take care of all the propagation of the species. With the rest, the sexual life is more or less repressed, but in this sexual life, there is another element, love life, which is, above all, a matter concerning the soul. Only when the soul element works on certain organs of the body do these organs become a manifestation, an expression of love life. Since this love life is held back in all the bees, except a single queen, the sexual life of the beehive is transformed into all this activity that the bees develop among themselves. That is why those much older and wiser people of a long time ago knew about this in a very different way than the way we know things today. They knew that the wonderful activity of the beehive pointed back to the condition of the bees' love life, the love life that these people associated in their minds with the planet Venus. About this, we can say the following. If you try to describe, on the one hand, wasps and ants in this regard, then they are considered animals that remove themselves more from the influence of the planet Venus. Bees, on the other hand, are completely open to this influence and develop this love life through the entire bee colony. This is a very wise form of life, for you can imagine how wise it would have to be. I've told you various things about their method of propagation. There is unconscious wisdom in it, a wisdom that they develop in their observable activities. That which we experience within ourselves only at a time when our hearts develop love is actually the very same thing that is present as a substance in the entire beehive. The whole beehive is permeated with life based on love. In many ways, the bees renounce love, and thereby this love develops within the entire beehive. You'll begin to understand the life of bees once you're clear about the fact that the bee lives as if it were in an atmosphere pervaded thoroughly by love. But the thing that a bee profits from the most is that it derives its substance from the very parts of a plant that are pervaded by the plant's love life. The bee sucks its nourishment, which it makes into honey, from the parts of a plant that are steeped in love life. And the bee, if you could express in this way, brings love life from the flowers into the beehive. So you'll come to the conclusion that you need to study the life of bees from the standpoint of the soul. So studying bees from the standpoint of the soul, I can give one little bit more about the morphology of the bee. The bee is unable to feed herself. When she takes up nectar or honey, it takes it into the honey crop, which is a storage organ. It's not a digestive organ. She can only, with that honey in the crop, or the nectar in the crop, let's call it the honey in the crop, she can only feed her sister. The only way she can eat is if his sister feeds her. So this takes love life to a very observable, physical, remarkable extreme. I don't think it does us much good, and this is just a personal opinion which can easily be refuted, but I'm going to state it anyway. I don't think we can really personify bees to good effect very much. And so while Dr. Seeley's book called Honeybee Democracy is an amazing book that I will read over and over in the course of life, the final chapter, which talks about transferring this way, this democracy, the seeming democracy that occurs in the hive and and bringing it into human life, I think is just a little bit of off the track. But I will say that acting in a way where we are expressing our physical love, now not a non-sexual love as Steiner described, in other words, in the hive it's very much repressed. What would it be on a human level if, without having to suppress our sexuality entirely, or only to the extent that we wish, what would it mean to really love one another? What would it mean to, like the bee, work entirely in the service of the other? This is the question that is always knocking at my heart as I learn more about the bee. The bee's gifts, you notice that we haven't spoken about honey at all, or wax, the products of the hive. As a beekeeper, those things are not what I'm interacting with the bee for. I'm interacting with the bee for the higher gift, which is love. So in the course of the year, when the bee reaches the time of the dandelion bloom, so in our latitudes, by our, I mean, I'm assuming we're in the Minneapolis area. When the dandelion blooms, you can hold that in your heart as the time when the bee knows that she will survive. She's been through a hard winter and has suffered cold, and in these days, what's worse than cold, bees can handle cold quite well. They just form a ball, and there's mechanisms beautiful mechanisms that allow circulation of honey and heat, warmth, all through the winter. So if it's the best case scenario for bees is for the temperature to fall very cold and to stay that way for 4 months, then they'll come out alive. When in our new environment where it gets cold and the bees are seemingly dormant, then it gets warm and they wake up and they need a little bite to eat so that they can get their thoughts going and then thinking about, is it time to go to work? And then it gets cold and they have to form that winter cluster again. By the time the bee makes it to the dandelion time and then is flying out, she is such a creature of love that all she wants to do is serve. The reserves in her hive are no more good to her because she gets supreme joy out of sweating 6 little wax platelets out of her belly to form wax. Without being able to do that, if the beekeeper gives her wax, she does not know that ecstasy of love of providing the structure of the comb. She doesn't need stored honey in the spring because her whole love intention is to go to the flowers at the point that the flowers are imbued most with love and take the nectar that the flower is offering her back to the hive. She doesn't keep that resource. It's a danger to her. There's a chance that she'll be robbed of it. And so at that point, those become a gift. So in that time, what we do is we take the honey from the hive and we store it in case there's an emergency. We store it through the whole summer, and if there's a dearth, a time of no nectar flow, we can feed her back her own honey. We don't feed her sugar water. Feed her back her own honey. And then through the winter, if she's caught short in her stores, we can give her her very own honey back to her to eat. When the dandelion times arrive, and we've got that honey we saved from last year, that's what she has given us. So the relation of honey as a gift to the bee is I think, an important one.
Or gift to the human, you mean?
Sorry, yes, a gift to the human. Thank you.
There's only a few minutes left, Em. You should see if there are any questions.
Thank you, Georgie. Are there any questions?
Could I go back to the Shakti Shiva connection again? I thought that was a really great description. Really, really great for a lot of reasons. Consciousness plus light, and looking at what Em had said earlier about the queen's flight to the sun, escorted by the drones impregnating her on her journey to the sun. I'm thinking like, we're looking at light workers here, are we not? We're looking at light workers, and I'm thinking like light workers, they can really transcend time and space if you think about it. I mean, they can pass on intergenerationally information, and they can collectively share almost like by location. Well, describing many go out and they see many locations at once. They describe this, and then others go out. If you think of the hive as a single organism with many component parts, we're looking at mastery of time and space. It's just a thought, but I'm thinking like, whoa, light workers.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Vaughn.
Paul's companion had her hand up.
Oh, yeah, I
That's
just,
Yeah.
thank you.
I wanted to have questions from women too.
Well, and I really want to thank you both for your presentations tonight, because I am I'm a beginning beekeeper, and the only thing I ever hear about is how much honey did you get? I haven't earned my honey yet. And so, and I honestly don't care. It's not my honey. And so I just want to thank you for the mythology and the Melissa, and all of the, I just can't even, I'm going to watch again. I'm going to rewatch, and I'll probably have questions for you like after, because I got all of your information from the chat, and I'm so thankful for this perspective, because everything I ever hear about bees is, well, how much honey did you get last year? I'm like, but the plants were beautiful. I didn't get any. I wouldn't take it. You know what I mean? Everything around is beautiful because of what they do. So and I'm going to put poetry all over my beehives. That was my new thing this summer. So anyway, that's just a thank you, a very sincere and deep thank you for what you've done tonight.
Thanks so much for that. Erica?
Yeah. Okay, there we go. I couldn't figure out where to put my hand to raise it. Camera. I made a couple of notes. I just wanted to say about what you were talking about, how when they swarm and they become that unified into like one, it's almost like the cells of a brain. And as they expand, when you were talking about how they expand out into that 6-mile radius and then come back, I felt like they were contained in like an energetic body, like a bioelectric body or something, that it's actually this body that breathes out and breathes in. And it was just like this wonderful visualization. I just wanted to say that. I also just wanted to ask how, I know we can find this on the internet, but I just had very few bees in my yard this year, and I intentionally seed white clover, hoping that that's the right thing. The bumbles love it. Oh, I love the bumblebees. But I have seen very few honeybees. And I am within
That's
a
because
6-mile
they're going
radius
extinct.
of the universe.
Bumblebees,
Yeah.
the American bumblebee is extinct in 8 states now, including just regular states. It's not like Alaska and Hawaii far away. It's like New Jersey and stuff.
Well, I mean, it's
but the white
honeybees that I
Dutch
see
clover,
right too.
the
Okay.
white Dutch clover, for us, it's also mountain mint, and getting rid of grass and putting in plants that are pollinator plants. You can just Google it.
Yeah.
Leaving your lawnmower up a little higher, so this is
I'm
the
more
higher
like 5
setting,
inches. Yeah.
and then just not using anything with the word "side" at the end of it.
Oh gosh,
Herbicide,
no.
pesticide.
Right.
There's
No,
lots of ways to do that, and I think that's
my
being
yard's
a bee
mess.
hero. Yeah, that's being very heroic for the bee, and whatever you've got to give her is exactly the right amount that she needs and nothing less. She's not asking you to become an entomologist. I was scared that she wanted more from me than I could do, but she wants exactly what you have to give and nothing less.
I did one other little tiny thing, literally tiny. I didn't realize how tiny bees can be. There were like these little 3-millimeter length bees, and I went down and I looked at them, and they had pollen on their teeny tiny little legs, and I was just like, oh my God, they're so cute.
Yeah, they're so beautiful.
I enjoyed this. All of them. I just love the bees.
Yeah, and thank you for
The hornets. I asked them to leave, but yeah.
Sure. But thanks for growing that Dutch white clover, because the bees will leave it alone and will totally disregard it But the Dutch white clover will continue to blossom through the dirt, and bam, one day you'll see bees all over it because there's nothing else for them. It's like that Dutch white clover there. The act of love of the Dutch white clover is to maintain, even without pollination, for a good long time.
Oh, that's good. That's good.
Is alfalfa good for bees or not?
Is what?
Is alfalfa good for bees?
Oh.
Do you know?
Oh, I don't know offhand.
Because it has a bloom. It has a,
Good question.
Yeah, a quick internet search, which is what I do when I don't know a plant well, is yes, it's a bee plant.
Yeah.
And the ones like goldenrod that are bee plants, let them go, let them come in, wing stem. The ones that aren't bee plants, the big one for me is buttercup that I'm trying to let go of. Buttercup comes in on top of clover and eats it up. And then things like ragweed that are pollinated by air, they're often the things that are rough on your allergies too, because they're in the air, like pine and stuff. The bee plants are typically not allergens because they're being taken around from the fuzziness of that bee's body. So.
Well, thank you. We're at 9:05. I'm just going to say that our official time is up, but if there's more questions, if you, Em and Georgie, if you we'll be here for another 5 minutes or so. If anyone has any other questions and they're just shy, maybe we can get them in quick, but otherwise, if you all are ready to go, our official time is over. So give me permission for that. I'm going to keep recording just because I think the questions might be pretty interesting. So then we'll turn it off in a bit. So
thank you all for showing up.
Thank you so much. And I love what Vaughn said about them being light workers. That sounds right to me.
Yeah. And I remember something about bees with being very sacred in Egypt, and maybe it's because of that sun and the straight up pattern that they have. So, I mean, they also have the scarab and different things, but bees are definitely a symbol in Egypt, and that's probably why. Knowing the feminine goddess,
Yeah. And you can start to. We lost several hives this winter. Spikenard didn't, but we are not as strong as a farm as Spikenard is at bee forage and continuity of bees. But I have learned a lot more about the Eastern Carpenter bee, about June bugs that are scarabs. I mean, like ancient Egypt and the way we worship scarabs, and these June bugs that have eggs in the ground all year, that just to eat grass and kind of aerate the dirt and then come up and fly for a couple weeks and they're gone again. And it's my great respect for other pollinators, even the ones that aren't typically beloved by gardeners and homeowners, is growing because I feel like the diversity of things keeps them in check with one another. Like the wasps come in and eat some of the carpenter bee larvae. The wasps are helping make the fruit sweeter on the farm. So there's this whole thing that Hymenoptera, which is ants, wasps, and bees can do. Hymen, if you think of, I think it's Latin for a veil, as this veil between the worlds that they are providing between the spiritual world and this world, that those insects are connecting and being the entrance into a deeper world of health.
Erica just put in the chat, in Egypt, the bee was the emblem of, oops, it just rolled up, was a symbol of the, oops, okay, I just scroll it up. I lost it. In Egypt, the bee was the emblem of Lower Egypt. The bee was a symbol of the giver of life, birth, death, and resurrection. It was believed the tears of Ra became the first working bees. Ra was the sun god and Egypt's most important deity. Yeah, okay, so no wonder it comes out. Yeah, thank you.
Can you say just a little bit more about the the bee dances. I'm wondering, are there certain set dances that each group of bees does? Like the queen has a dance, the workers have a dance, the drones have a dance, or are the dances varying from time to time, that they're not like set dances, like X number of dances, that they're communicating things new and fresh and almost an infinite number of messages? I'm just curious about the dances.
Georgie, did you want to take that?
I could start and then you could finish. I mean, the Waggle Dance is famous, and that shows there's a lot we don't know about these, okay? But certain dances, certain movements we figured out are designed to show direction of like a geolocation and distance of a possible new hive spot. There are also, I mean, at some point when I was really getting into bees, I thought, like, why have I studied all these weird things in my life? And how do they go together? And I'm like, if I hadn't studied some dance and some music, I wouldn't understand the bees, because they are very rhythmic. One of the ways that M catches a swarm is when they swarm, they may swarm up into the top of a tall tree, but he will use drumming on a big sounding, like any big sounding pot or something, almost like an African beat that's very, that calls them down to the spot where it calls them down to the ground where then he can house them. And so this connection of rhythm and movement to indicate all kinds of things is confusing. The other movement that I'm very aware of is that drones, unlike, if you have a worker bee and go into another hive, they'll sting her, kill her, take her out. It just won't work. She's not going. No, she can't go around. The drones can go anywhere they like. So what are drones really doing in the whole scheme of things in terms of communicating between hives for who knows how far? They go to find another hive and talk about things. And then they form these big also drone clouds in the sky and communicate about when hopefully they'll meet a virgin queen that comes up to enjoy another great dance that I have, this beauty of natural insemination and natural childbirth in terms of the swarm is something that seems very healthy and very feminist to me, as someone who kind of grew up in the time when they were still routinely scheduling C-sections so that the doctor could, go home at 5 o'clock. But which is what we do to swarms now. We try and squash this swarm cell and make a split. We split them so they won't swarm. Because if you're managing, like the largest bee company in the US has 70,000 hives that they use to transplant from almond grove to almond grove and pollinate all these different monolithic mega farms, you can't let the bees swarm. What the heck are you going to do with 70,000 swarming hives? But that kind of thinking has filtered down to the hobbyist bee club, where you are saying that all you hear is how to keep bees at this level that's only appropriate for the monster organization. So those are a few of the dances I know. And then what the drones are doing, I think that's a wonderful, fruitful area for delving into the spiritual mystery, and for people that are smarter than me to observe and learn with additional scientific instruments. As long as they're not hurting the bees, I'm not. I don't mean to be anti-science in any way possible. I love the peer-reviewed research that's coming out. I just don't want them to put cameras and things in the beehive.
Yeah, thanks, Georgie. And so the two dances that I think get most attention are the Waggle Dance, to describe where where some good forage can be found. And so the direction of the dance is important because the bees are able to indicate and the angle from the sun to follow, to make the beeline to go out and get forage. So the dance actually gives directions and gives some idea about how much forage can be found in an area. And the other dance that I'm familiar with is as the swarm is hanging in its cluster, you'll see on the outside of the swarm different scout bees, as I said, dancing and giving the same direction so that the bees can find the hollows that they're trying to describe. So those two dances are pretty well documented, but your question all of a sudden opened up, for me as it obviously did for Georgie, kind of some new questions of where else is dancing to be found. I think that's a really profound question to see where else dancing is to be found in a hive or out of the hive. So thank you for that, because that's going to occupy me. I can tell right now.
Okay, I got a question. Should the beehives be placed on a ley line, or where ley lines cross, or away from ley lines?
So the question is one about human agency and what the humans can do to optimize. I'm assuming to optimize something in the hive. I don't think I'm not aware of any research that's been done on that very topic, Donald, but I appreciate you asking that because one would think that the ley lines would be powerful enough or strong enough as indicators that a form of life that has a sensitivity to them would certainly make use of them. Here's the thing about bees and housing things is that when bees go out to find their new cavity where they can then erect or set up a new body, which is what happens in this whole swarming process of birth, is they're looking for an empty space to build a body in. And that depends on, in days past, on hollows in trees. And in order to get a hollow, there's a long process, not only of the rotting, but then different animals take up a residency there, and so there's a progression until finally it's ready for the honeybee to use. Whether those things fall along ley lines is a great question. And again, I mean, I'm carrying with me away from this meeting some very profound questions that I don't know the answers to, but are worthy of my observation and conscious observation. So Donald, thank you for that question.
I just have a quick question and a comment. First, just to say that I really enjoyed the presentation. I told you on the phone yesterday, or whenever we talked, Em.
Oh, you accidentally muted yourself. Okay.
Oh.
There we go. What did you hear? Just
said when we talked on the phone yesterday, and then
whenever we talked, I was telling you I was a bee novice, and I came into this as an open book because I know very little, and it was wonderful. And I have a new appreciation for the bees. And my question is, as you talked about Steiner, and there was a Steiner quote early on about the bees, and my mind started drifting back, dusting off the cobwebs. I used to work at a Waldorf school in the 90s, and it just vaguely started coming back to me that there's more emphasis about the bees in the Waldorf schools, and which are Steiner schools. in Europe, mainly in Waldorf schools in the US. So do you know, I wasn't in the classroom, but I just now, it's triggered my memories that there were more with bees in the Waldorf schools. Do you happen to know if that's continuing, what they're doing, anything with the children?
Yeah, so I haven't read in any of Steiner's works on education anything specifically about the bee, but I have read about gardening. So gardening is a large part of the curriculum in the Waldorf schools, and the Waldorf teachers that we know definitely added bees for the benefit of the children. And you can imagine what a powerful learning tool a beehive is on many, many levels. Partly because there's always this threat, a possibility of being stung. So how do you hold space for bees in a school situation? And these teachers are doing that, and I think that that's an adjunct. I could be wrong, and I would love it if I found a lecture Steiner gave on bees in the Waldorf school. I would read it avidly. But I think that the inclusion of gardening, then it's a natural step to bring bees into the garden. I think that's how it might have gone.
Yeah, and that courtyard. So that theme of anthroposophy certainly worked its way down into that, expression, that aspect with the children, what their teachers were emphasizing about bees. At least in my Minneapolis experience.
So you'll notice that the one I didn't have photographs including people because I knew that we were going to be recording, and I didn't want to compromise people's feelings about that. But you'll notice that the one picture of it actually is Alex holding up a frame close to his face with no veil. This is another spirit to spirit kind of relationship that we have going when you are unprotected from stings and you present yourself to a hive, especially if you're going to do some large gesture like tear the roof off it, and then lift the walls out one by one, you working without a veil or jacket or gloves or anything is a way to become very sensitive to the mood of the bees. And so it's really kind of wonderful to see at Spikenard a whole class of 50 people in a hive, in a apiary of maybe 35 hives, and going into them. And you'll see, in order to do that, it's a very reverent thing. One opens one's self to the bee, and one makes a declaration of what one's intentions are, and then the bee can answer back pretty well. One behavior that they have that I pointed out is when a single bee comes toward you and is doing this, it's checking you out, and how you react at that point is really kind of critical. If you try to blow the bee away or start doing that, then the bee now is going in amongst your hands and your breath and everything, and is getting a different message than if you remain still and calm. So we're able to really gauge the mood of a hive, and we don't hesitate at all to back out. Because you never know what's going on inside there. There might be some necessary thing that's occurring where they don't want any human intervention at the moment, and they'll tell you clearly that they don't. And then we just recede, and we decide to come back another day.